Thanks everyone for taking a few minutes. Maybe I'll start with one or two questions that we had talked about previously that didn't come up today, and then through the chat box. And John, if there are particular things that you'd like to focus on, you can absolutely do that as well. One topic was around collective trust and trust in the industry as a whole, whether it's a financial services or the medical profession or a political system. We've seen many cases where collective trust has been damaged over the last decade or so. So we'd be interested in any thoughts about that phenomenon and what individual institutions can do to try to offset it. And I'll just open the floor for whoever might have thoughts on that.
Well, I can start just from a sort of a construct or theory perspective, and that's this idea, right, that collective trust or organizational trust is more complicated, just because individuals have more to lose than organizations and collectives do. So inherently there is an imbalance in the relationship that develops. From the neuroscience perspective, we know that companies and organizations, collectives, are likely treated as individuals, which is interesting. So we develop personal relationships with an organization, and we expect the reciprocity and the sort of the tit for tat kind of arrangement that we would develop with an interpersonal friendship or a colleague, despite the fact that there is inherently this imbalance. And that, of course, can lead to, pretty tragic things that can develop and happen when that sort of vulnerability, that imbalance shows its ugly head. So that's where I'll start.
I've thought about this a lot in terms of the government and the trusting government as an institution, just from my previous life. And I think about the ways in which individual interactions, government interactions, or individual information is attributed to the entire entity. And so thinking about, there's a concept in criminal justice around, it's called procedural justice, but the idea is if you feel good about the way you were treated, even if you don't like the outcome, that you actually leave with a better feeling and a feeling, at some level of trust in both the process, but also the institution, than you do, even if you get a good outcome, but you were treated disrespectfully. So you think about this in interactions with law enforcement, in interactions with, sometimes in discipline with schools. And I actually think there's a lot for private sector to think about with respect to customer service, or the ways in which people understand how are you supposed to navigate the unexpected, something happens that you didn't want with a company or in a consumer context. The treatment you receive can actually be an opportunity to build trust, even though you didn't like the reason that you had to pursue that. And I think that that's actually a little bit counterintuitive sometimes. For human nature can be, I didn't do anything wrong, we didn't do anything wrong. And instead, if you think about it, actually, this is a great opportunity to invest in the future trusting relationship with this consumer, or with this citizen, with this constituent. I think there's a lot of power in that as an example.
I think it's a great example, and a lot of the work we do is in the influence business. And what I hear from a lot of our staff is, I'm fine with the decision, fine you didn't take it in the direction that I had recommended, but I have no idea why. Just give me some feedback and explain the other factors that perhaps I was not aware of that led to a different decision than I might have been advocating for. And that, I think, is an example of having faith in the process, even if you don't like the specific outcome. Any other thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, Kevin, I think for me, made me go back to your question about collaboration, right? And so, especially when we're not face to face, we have to almost manufacture those discussions to explain, the rationale and the background and the information. So transparency was the word that came to mind when you asked this question, right? About making sure that we continue to trust. And so again, we have to work much harder, I think, to be transparent with our teams when we're just all on a call doing a, quick staff meeting and we're not seeing their faces. And so I think then the transparency and that collaboration, gets us back to where we need to be in terms of continuing to trust about decisions that we may not necessarily agree with, but at least have had a discussion about.
Let me ask maybe the most open-ended of all questions. So are there any topics that you thought we would have covered or would have come up in the Q&A that didn't? Like what didn't we cover that we should have?
There were so many questions in the Q&A. I mean, they were all fantastic, really. People were really spot on. I think we could have had an all-day conversation. I think the one elephant in the room that didn't come up either in the Q&A as we also discussed in the pre-session discussion, right, is this idea that Margaret already got to, which is, when there are these epic failings or when there is this growing distrust, not just in industries, but in government, structural change, how do you rebuild from that? How can you, take what we've all been discussing and transform that? Is it transformable? That side of things, I think, was the one aspect that, of course, we didn't have time to get to, which is a more philosophical and deeper conversation.
I think the two for me, and we touched on them a little bit, one of them I mentioned at the end is sort of this extensibility into the future, right? So, how do you take the examples I gave are from, a more tactical process, but if you're starting new projects, building new teams, trying to brainstorm and create for the future, which we all are, applying all of these strategies and then even our new adapted strategies into the future, I just personally think is really challenging. And so you could have a whole discussion almost a back and forth about how people are even thinking about that. I don't think anyone has the answer. So that's the first one. The other one, again, we touched on a little bit, was decision making. And so how do you flex your decision making? And by that, I mean, if I personally have to make a really tough risk decision, I get the three other decision makers and we sit in a room, even now, right? I want to look them in the eye. We are going to go launch these people on this rocket. I want to look them in the eye, and we do that kind of up the chain as we get to where we're ready to fly. And that's very different than, sort of day-to-day type stuff. So that decision-making for me personally very much flexes based on the amount of trust I need, and the risk involved. And so I think that would be an interesting topic. But again, it's probably, another couple hours. Those are my two thoughts.
Holly, on our earlier call, you gave a good anecdote of, in certain situations, the decision-making is well-structured and pre-thought out, and you have a very specific decision tree. In other cases, in the moment, the acute event happens, and then it's you standing at the console by yourself, and you got to make a call. Could you talk a little bit about those two different modes of decision-making?
Yeah, I would actually say there's almost three. And so if you're at the console, and Kevin, that was for me, right?
Yes.
Prom glitched for 2 seconds. Okay. If you're, it's interesting because I think that, that we'll call this the pre-flight process, right? Every group does their review and then you pass it up to the next gate and you pass it up to the next gate. And, I run our review for operations, myself and the chief astronaut. So we're not the very last gate before we fly, but we're pretty, we're one of the last several. And so that definitely has a process, but the topics themselves, hey, are we going to allow, a non-conformance of a part? That might have never been discussed before. And so you end up with that structural process, but the technical topics can be very new and unknown and have a lot of variability in them. That to me is a very different process than console, right? Because you don't have the time pressure. The thing about console is, like, most of the time you've got to make a decision. And so Zab and I have a friend named Preston, and it's that he described it once as the 70% problem or the 700% problem, right? If before you launch you have 700% of the data, you can wait and get the data and talk about it forever. And in console you have 70% of the data and you got to go. You got to make a decision. So those are really the two biggest, the biggest difference in the two mindsets, right? And then the third one is this sort of new stuff. I got to go work with somebody to build a lander. That actually doesn't fit into either category. You don't have 700% of the data, but you don't have to make a decision right away in this 70% console. So we're sort of creating this third category of decision making that we're all actually kind of learning together as we put Artemis, put all the parts of Artemis, out on the board and get them to work.
Margaret or Maria, any topics that you thought we could have covered but didn't?
Well, I've been just going through the Q&As and I saw one of the questions around, how do you prevent, referring to the whole system in a room intervention that I've been discussing, but how do you prevent that people point fingers and end up in having a blame game if you have everybody in the room? And I think, it also taps into what we're talking about, collective trust. I think it's crucial, of course, that you slice the elephant, so to speak, right? If we're talking about these huge notions of collective distrust in government and societies and the banking industry, we have to peel it down, of course, and it has to become personal and it has to become more individual in order to grasp it, in order to do something about it. And so in making collective trust more personal, but also in avoiding a blame game, also in those type of interventions, you have to bring it down to people's own experience and their own perceptions, and make sure that people, in those discussions are being personal also about, what is it, what's troubling their mind? Where's the distrust coming from? What is it you need? So I just, that crossed my mind. That is just crucial. Otherwise you slip away on these huge conceptual, philosophical discussions, and you lose, you swallow in there and you drown.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think something very similar, but it's in some ways much more tactical. The humility associated with actual trust and building trust, I think, can be overlooked. And we did talk a little bit about this, but I think that, exactly as Mariah was saying, by breaking things down and talking about it from an individual perspective, you get away from these very big concepts, and which can lead to a mismatch of expectations. I think if you're talking about, we're talking about NASA, they can do anything, right? As opposed to, this is the responsibility in this specific circumstance for this specific set of activities, and you're talking about the way in which maybe in an individual product launch went within the technology context, or in a government, the way an investigation or a program was run, as opposed to thinking about it, it's this, sort of nameless, faceless institution which should have known to do better. Thinking about it in terms of individual people who can make mistakes and who obviously always do, because we all do, and then being able to own that and what we can learn from it, I think is a really, valuable way of thinking about how we can take those learnings into the future and make them extensible, as Holly was talking about.
John, any topics that you'd like to cover?
Yeah, a couple things, Kevin, and it's really fascinating. The webinar is on banking culture, and we started with there, and we've covered so much ground. So I'm going to ask a couple. I guess I ask a favor of all of you is that if we can continue to engage in some of these topics in some way, because I think two things that I'm very much beyond everything we've talked about are forefront of my mind. One is this issue of return to work. What does the future of work look like? And I was listening to the conversation about the importance of eye contact, the importance of interactions. Holly talked about that a lot, but you all did. And thinking about what is the in the new normal, whatever that means. What are the things we should be very careful to avoid? What are the things that we need to be able to be better at? We're thinking about that. We don't know what the new normal is at all. But that's something that I think is really important, because I do see us, not traveling as much, not having as many in-person meetings with colleagues that we collaborate with, at least not in the same way, but also, having more of a flexible work model in the future of some kind. So that's one topic I would love to hear more about in the future. The other one that maybe is not unique to the Fed, I think it's actually true of all the organizations that we work in, is this external kind of sense of where the organization or whether it's mistakes or I think Margaret said you should have known those kind of issues. I think those have profound effects on people's psychology. We went through, at the New York Fed with the global financial crisis that led to a lot of, criticism, second guessing, and things that really do shape how people think about decision making, and in a good way, learning from the past, but also in a way of that every decision is a bit, has a bit of that, well, how will this be perceived? So I think that, as we think also about how do we as organizations, whether it's in the financial industry or whether it's, in our own, how do we help, create the safety that you talked about, which, is so important, but at the same time, in a context where, you're going to read there's a good chance that a month from now you're going to be reading your emails in the New York Times.
Well, I was going to say, I think there's actually a really nice dovetail with your next session on diversity and inclusion, because I think part of the way that sometimes these things that become cringeworthy when they become public is because you didn't have all the necessary perspectives at the table when a decision was coming, or that the people being consulted didn't have the full view of how something might be understood externally or by different stakeholders. And I think, in the same way that what we are no longer referring to as soft skills are mission critical, I do think that diversity and really thinking about who needs to be here and who isn't here that might make us make a better decision is actually a critical element of thinking about how things will, how decisions will be able to be made that will have greater endurance in the future.
Yeah. So, hey, John, I would just say I'm happy to keep the conversation going. The way I figure out things is to think out loud a little bit, with very small groups of people, not big groups of people. And it's very helpful to hear it, from a different perspective. I love space people, but I always joke that solving problems like this with space people is not, as effective as other folks, right? I just think you get a better discussion. We talked a lot about kind of the positives of eye contact and having an anchor and needing to be, physically present. But we didn't talk about the positives of staying home and, not having to travel and getting time back in your day and, eating dinner with your family. And so, there's a whole conversation around what I've started to call in my head the hybrid model, right? And fundamentally, where is the balance? And you know, I keep going back to collaboration in my head, because what I have seen is actually people are, it depends, right? But in a lot of cases, people are more willing to like say what they think with the cameras off, because, you know, they've got some immunity almost, or they're, but it's often harder to make a decision. So you can get good collaborative discussion, sometimes even slightly more pointed than you might have in person, but it's hard to make a decision because you don't have everyone in the room kind of looking and the leaders kind of staring around. So, you know, there's a hybrid there in terms of, you know, the level of risk, the level of decision, you know, how much collaboration you need, how big the team is, how small. And I just keep trying to figure out how you use all those mechanisms in this hybrid model that I think we're going to end up in, and only hybrid being the definition of part of what we've learned in the pandemic and part of what we did before, right?
Yeah, I'll jump in here and spin some neuroscience into the conversation, which is, you know, this idea of learning and decision making are actually really interconnected in our cognitive processes. And we learn from mistakes. We don't learn because we're correct all the time. And I think that has not made its way into our constructs about education, our feedback systems, you know, our after action reviews sometimes take into those kinds of accounts, but a lot of organizations don't do after action reviews in any formal sense, like NASA and military operations do. But I think, you know, the other thing that we know, right, is that immediate feedback is really, really critical. And so, you know, what you see in organizations, you know, is that there is more demand on doing feedback. But now, like, for example, in my organization, which is a university, it's quarterly, right? And so it is supposed to help facilitate more conversations from happening, but people now feel just sort of burdened now, you know, once every 3 months instead of once a year, but it is not immediate, and one doesn't learn from delayed feedback as well. You just take things personally and then you hold grudges. And we know this from an educational standpoint. You know, we know exactly what the brain mechanisms are which facilitate learning, which is that the brain calculates an error prediction. That these are related to how you make decisions, and you learn and you aggregate evidence and make subsequent decisions later on, which is that you sort of take into the account, you know, what was the prediction that your brain made or your neurons made, and what was the actual outcome. And then that helps facilitate that learning process. And I think we could start to use that more directly in organizational structures to try and revise things. That doesn't mean that, you know, that HR feedback should be moment to moment. That's impossible, right? But it does mean that the idea of taking learning from errors and doing that as immediately as possible, and doing that, as Margaret said, with more stakeholders in the room, and not necessarily just the perspective that should come from leadership, right? One of the things that I think has become very clear is that the biggest mistakes that have been made at any, you know, in any organization come from not taking into account a perspective that actually was really critical to that, whether that's from a diverse member of a team, or a lower level person, or a consumer, right? The people that are actually using the products, you know, that kind of thing. So I think, you know, that will all be much more helpful going forward.
Before we wrap up, I just wanted to take 1 minute to give a shout out to the team who made this happen: Jim Hennessy, Stephanie Chaley, Jackie McCormick, and Tony DiCario. They have been the intellectual drivers of this effort for many years, and the real energizing force that has kept it going, and deserve an enormous amount of credit for not just this panel, but for making the whole New York Fed effort so impactful over several years. So thank you all for that. And thanks again, everyone, for participating today.